As a public media organization, our mission is to connect listeners and members like you to each other and around the world. Public radio works because listeners and members who value the service step up and give back. The support for public media at WMU comes from the public. Support from listeners and members is also our most reliable and important source of funding, especially right now. This book club would not be possible if we did not have your support. So if you have been enjoying these monthly virtual book clubs, please consider making a gift. You can go to dianerehm.org/give. We are grateful for over 2,310 people who registered to join us today. That's an amazing amount of people. Just so you know, this event is being recorded and streamed on Facebook. Closed captioning is available. Just click the button on your screen. And now let's start the discussion with the host of our book club, Diane Rehm.
Thank you, Lynn. It's always good to see you and hear you. Thank you. And to all of you, welcome to our January book club. Virtual, continuing to be virtual. Today's selection is The Dutch House by Ann Patchett. She wrote it in 2019. It tells the story of two siblings whose mother abandons them as young children. They grow up in an old Pennsylvania mansion with their distant father, and I must say, someone I think of as a wicked stepmother right out of a fairy tale. It's a story about family, loss, love, and ask the question, can we ever leave our past behind us? So, joining me today, Maureen Corrigan. She's book critic for NPR's Fresh Air. Maureen, welcome.
Thank you, Diane. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And Ayana Mathis. She's the author of 12 Tribes of Hattie. Welcome, Ayana. It's good to have you.
Oh, it's so lovely to come back again. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you. And Mark Brazaitis. He's professor of English and director of the West Virginia Writers Workshop at West Virginia University. Good to see you again, Mark.
Wonderful to see you, Diane. Nice to be back with you for a third time. I appreciate it.
Good. Thank you. And of course, we'll be taking your questions throughout the hour. At the bottom of your screen is that Q&A button, and you can submit your questions through that venue. We have to say that we already have a great many questions from our listeners, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. I'd like to begin our discussion with a clip from the recording of the book that Tom Hanks was wonderful to do. And so here it is.
The first time my father brought Andrea to the Dutch house, Sandy, our housekeeper, came to my sister's room and told us to come downstairs. Your father has a friend he wants you to meet, she said. Is it a work friend? Maeve asked. She was older and so had a more complex understanding of friendship. Sandy considered the question. I'd say not. Where's your brother? Window seat, Maeve said. Sandy had to pull the draperies back to find me. Why do you have to close the drapes? I was reading. Privacy, I said. Though at 8, I had no notion of privacy. I liked the word. and I liked the boxed-in feel the draperies gave when they were closed. As for the visitor, it was a mystery. Our father didn't have friends, at least not the kind who came to the house late on a Saturday afternoon. I left my secret spot and went to the top of the stairs to lie down on the rug that covered the landing. I knew from experience I could see into the drawing room by looking between the newel post and the first baluster if I was on the floor. There was our father in front of the fireplace with a woman, and from what I could tell, they were studying the portraits of Mr. and Mrs. Vanubeek. I got up and went back to my sister's room to make my report. "It's a woman," I said to Maeve. Sandy would have known this already. Sandy asked me if I'd brushed my teeth, by which she meant, had I brushed them that morning? No one brushed their teeth at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Sandy had to do everything herself because Jocelyn had Saturdays off. Sandy would have laid the fire and answered the door and offered drinks, and on top of all that, was now responsible for my teeth. Sandy was off Mondays. Sandy and Jocelyn were both off Sundays because my father didn't think people should be made to work on Sundays. "I did," I said, because I probably had. "Do it again," she said, "and brush your hair." The last part she meant for my sister, whose hair was long and black and as thick as 10 horsetails tied together. No amount of brushing had ever made it look brushed.
And of course, that is Tom Hanks reading, narrating the narrator's part of Danny. Danny is the person we hear from throughout the book. Maureen, how does that early part of the book, from the first page to the second, how does that set the scene for us?
Oh, as I was hearing Tom Hanks read that opening so beautifully and give it so many layers, I was thinking like an English professor for a moment, and remembering that's exactly how Jane Eyre opens, where we have our narrator, Jane Eyre, kind of in a window seat, cut off from the rest of the life of the house by curtains. And in a way, it's a visual representation of Danny's place in the novel. He's our narrator. He becomes cut off from the rest of the life of the house, from Andrea, who will become his stepmother, and from his father, who's such a remote person anyway. And it's wonderful that he's our narrator because he's so young that his memory of things is incomplete. So part of the point of the Dutch house is to ask that question about the reliability of memory and the stories that we tell ourselves about our childhood. And as we see throughout this novel, those stories keep getting readjusted and corrected and challenged. And so it's really, I think, a brilliant stroke to have him as our narrator.
Ayana, how do you feel about Danny as the narrator?
I think I have a slightly different take on him as a narrator than Maureen does, only because he's an interesting character, right? In that there's a lot of his father in him, a certain kind of remoteness, a certain sort of inability to engage with the things around him, a certain difficulty in, how would you put it, reading the room, you know what I mean? He doesn't, and a certain difficulty in sort of extending himself beyond himself enough to understand the relationships between people. Like, for example, a little later in the novel, there's a section in which Sandy and Jocelyn, who are the servants in the Dutch house, who are very close to him, they care for him and he cares for them, but he doesn't know that they're sisters, for example, right? Because he sort of seems to be a little bit unable to sort of think beyond his nose, really, you know? So for me, it was interesting. Having him as a narrator was an interesting thing because sometimes I found that he seemed to lack the kind of emotional and psychic acumen to be able to exfoliate the story in ways that I think might have brought me a little closer. Sometimes I found him a tad bit distancing as a narrator.
Talk about distancing. What about their father, Mark? I mean, it seems to me he bringing this woman, Andrea, into the house without forewarning them, without saying a word to them about her. he seems like the most distant character in the whole novel.
He certainly is a distant character. And like many men, he has a well of reserve that becomes detrimental. He's not good at communication. He communicates through his actions, and his actions in some cases, and particularly when he invites Andrea into his children's lives, that's a devastating move. And I think one of the questions that I had was what attracted him to Andrea. There's the mention of, oh, she's as passionate about the Dutch house as he is. So there's that shared interest in the house.
I think she's more passionate about the house than she is about the man she's going to marry.
Yeah.
I think that could be true. There's some, Danny alludes a little bit to maybe a physical attraction between them, but we never really see that.
What
Yeah,
do
he
you think?
talks a lot about feeling as though he was sort of stupidly ignorant of why his dad would marry this woman, because she was pretty and she was young and all these things. But I also kind of wondered what it was, but like, was she supposed to be a trophy wife? Like, I couldn't figure out exactly what it was that that he felt that she brought to him,
And that's also, for me, the fairy tale aspect of this story, right? She is the wicked stepmother, so to speak, but just the way she does appear in that first scene without explanation, and all of a sudden your whole world is rocked and changed. Yeah, I love that, and I think it's only possible to tell the story that way because Danny is so young when that happens. He can't fill in those gaps.
And what do we know about Danny and his sister Maeve's mother?
Well, Maeve kind of idealizes her mother, which is understandable. And also, I think, explains her particular attachment to the house itself. I think she associates it with her mother and a kind of perfect time that might have existed when her mother was there. Whereas Danny admits to not having, I think, any memory of his mother. He remembers Fluffy striking him, but he doesn't remember his mother. So he approaches the mother's return to skip way ahead in a different way than Maeve for obvious reasons.
Of course, but do we understand early on why the mother left her children, her husband, just walking away, Ayana?
I think that's a really interesting question because I don't think that we ever really do. But it does seem that a couple of things are being sort of set up, or there's an attempt to explore a couple of things. One of them, I think, seems to be a kind of tension between goodness and godliness and one's responsibility to family. Like at a certain point in the novel, I think it's either Jocelyn, forgive me for looking at my notes, it's Sandy, and she says, quote, "I think it's hard for people like us to understand, but when you think about saints, I don't imagine any of them made their families happy." So there's some kind of that sort of, I think, certainly an idea that's underlying some of the mother's absence and her decision to leave, and a kind of an echo of a certain kind of a sort of self-sacrificing austerity that we find in these kind of famed Catholic women mendicant types, going way back to people like Marguerite Porete or the Beguines, and then, up certainly to Mother Teresa. And so I think there's an echo there, certainly, that's being kind of drawn upon to not explain, which is a nice thing about the novel. I think it avoids trying to give us a one-to-one explanation of here's why she left, but certain things are, I think, being gestured towards or called upon to give us some clues about it.
One of our listeners wrote in and asked the question, how much does Catholicism play out in this novel? Maureen?
I don't know if I'm speaking as the only Catholic on the panel, the only person who was raised and went to Catholic schools for 12 years. So, and teaches at Georgetown, right?
Those are good credentials.
Yeah, exactly. You've got street cred.
Well, I definitely connect with what Ayana said about the self-abnegation and almost like the pleasure that you get from denial. I could see that in the mother, and I could recognize that personality trait in people I knew as I was growing up. That there's a certain self-satisfaction you have in denying yourself the beautiful house and the luxury items. And also, I think Ann Patchett does a really interesting portrait of the mother as someone who's very uncomfortable with wealth and material things. But for me, this is a Catholic novel the same way that The Great Gatsby is a Catholic novel. Fitzgerald, people have written a lot about Fitzgerald's Catholicism and the way Catholicism sort of gives breath to The Great Gatsby. There's that sense of yearning throughout the novel for something that's out of your reach, just as in Gatsby, obviously. All of the characters here are reaching for someone or for a time that they can't quite grasp again. And in a way that it would take me like 3 hours to explain, that feels very Catholic to me, that reaching for something beyond.
But why the house, Mark? Why is the house so central here in this novel?
I think physically it has a certain kind of draw. It's distinct in its grandness and its arrangement of rooms, and the fact, interestingly, that you can see right through it, which is ironic given what Danny and Maeve can't see throughout much of the novel. So there's that allure of it being the mansion on the hill, as it were. I also thought it could be any house in a sense, that Maeve would have had the same reaction because, again, of its association with this idealized mother who left. So in some ways, it didn't have to be the Dutch house. It could be any house USA, and Maeve might have wanted to pull up there with her brother in the car and smoke and talk about times past.
It's so interesting to me that there's so much talk about glass and being able to see through that house from front to back. That doesn't strike me as a Dutch house.
Yeah.
I think of it as a very modern house with glass in the front showing through all the way to the back. Maybe I've got the wrong idea, but we must say that as soon as the father bought the house, without even telling his wife he had bought the house, he takes her to the house and she immediately hates the house. She wants to get away from it as quickly as she can.
And that's what happens when Danny grows up. He buys a house that it turns out his wife hates.
Exactly.
Yeah.
History repeats itself.
Yeah. It was interesting too, in talking about the house, it occurred to me that there's something, as much as it certainly has this sort of modern aesthetic, what we think of. I mean, I think the house is purposely communicated to us with these wonderfully concrete details, but then the rest of it is sort of left to our imagination, so that fairy tale kind of thing that Maureen was mentioning. But it also occurs to me that there's something sort of cathedral-like about that house. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's ornate and these kind of really high ceilings, and that was, and I wondered, going back to this idea of Catholicism and the ways it's being sort of gestured towards in the novel, I wondered if there was something like that. And I thought interesting too, that the mother would get there into the ornateness of this kind of cathedral and reject it utterly, because the manifestations of her faith are more like a kind of on the ground, vows of poverty, nun-like, which is in fact what she was going to be before her husband came and got her out of, she was going to be a novice, I think. And then her husband, who was going to be her husband, decided that, he wanted to marry her, and he sort of drags her away. So there's something really interesting there as well happening with the house, I think.
Yeah, it does become a church, particularly for Maeve, I think.
Mm-hmm.
This holy place that was ripped out from her, taken away from her. And it seems like her journey is to return there in spirit, if not in person. But be careful, of course, what you wish for. When the mother does return, there's this brief idyllic period between them, and then this devastating twist related to the, well, I guess I can say, right, because everyone's read the book, that her mother, Elna, then partners up with Andrea at the end. And what a horrific twist for Maeve. What an unexpected twist for someone who has held a candle for so long for her mother, despite Danny's negative attitudes toward her.
What about Danny's reluctance to marry? That struck me as sort of reflecting what he saw in his own primary family. But there is an initial relationship between the woman he marries and Maeve, his sister. And then it sort of devolves into something not quite healthy.
I love that Maeve didn't like Celeste, Danny's wife, at first, because I think Maeve, as both Mark and Ayana are talking about, Maeve kind of can edge into that almost saintly like figure like her mother. And the fact that Maeve comes to loathe Celeste and Celeste returns the loathing, I thought was refreshing, that it made them certainly more human. The main relationship here, of course, is between Maeve and Danny, the brother and sister. That's where the energy is. And Patchett, I think, often does this. She gives us family groupings that are out of the box, that aren't conventional. And so, at the very end of the novel, when we've got the return to the Dutch house and the past is repeated, the past does come back, it's kind of reconstituted with different characters, different people who occupy the original places of the original family. And, I found the ending really satisfying that way.
Really satisfying. Did you find it satisfying, Ayana?
I don't know. I really struggled with the ending, I think. For a couple of reasons. I mean, I like the sort of bringing all the original players, particularly the ones that were off stage, like Elna, the mother. I like this notion of bringing them all back in, because we certainly were yearning to kind of see them. And the reader had this sort of, felt the same sort of yearning that Maeve did in a certain sense, to kind of at least see this mother. But I think I had difficulty with a certain neatness with the ending, sort of getting getting the house back, albeit it's Danny's daughter who buys the house, so it's a generation removed. Nonetheless, so we get that back. And then the other thing I think I had trouble with was that I was perplexed by Elna's decision to care for Andrea. Andrea has some sort of dementia. We don't know, the novel doesn't specify, but she's in very poor health. And Elna returns and sort of cares for her up until her death. And there's a wonderful line. The novel is so beautifully written, but there's a wonderful line in which Elna says something to the effect of, one provides service to people who need it, not to people who sort of make you feel more comfortable in giving them service.
Right.
And for her to say that about Andrea seemed odd to me, not because she would have felt antagonism for her or should have, but rather because Andrea was in fact not in need of her service. You know, I mean, she's a woman who's very wealthy, who could have sort of gotten what she needed elsewhere, I think. So I was sort of confused, you know, for a woman like Elna, who has spent her life serving people who were in abject need, to kind of make this equivalence between Andrea and the people that she'd been serving for her life. So that also, I think, was hard for me to kind of get my head around.
You know, as you're talking, Ayana, I don't know if anybody else has read Mary Gordon's Final Payments lately. It was one of her, it might have been her first novel. It's a very Catholic novel. And it's about a woman who ultimately performs service for the person in her life she would find most difficult to perform that service to. And I guess I disagree with you about Elna and Andrea, that, you know, it would be awkward to be taking care of your husband's second wife, the woman who replaced you in a sense. And so you get even higher marks, you know, as a Catholic saint, if you're doing something even tougher like that. Elna, though she is a cipher ultimately. She's such she's the most internal character of all to me, even more so than the husband.
To Maeve, her mother, Elna, she accepts her back into her life with such open arms, and Danny is very resentful. He's not only resentful, he's indeed jealous of the relationship between Elna, the mother, and Maeve, the sister. Do you think that jealousy was justified, Mark?
Oh, I think so. I think there's a sense of an Oedipal connection between siblings there. Maeve certainly shows maybe an unhealthy possessiveness of Danny at times, which explains why she's jealous of Celeste and dislikes Celeste so much ultimately. But getting back to the ending question, I had the feeling that the book might have ended on page 253, which is when Danny and Maeve, they've just come back from the Nutcracker, and they pulled up to the house again, and they see Andrea approaching them. So here's this opportunity, this very fraught opportunity, this opportunity full of conflict. And then it just kind of passes. They drive off, but there's a sense that they've overcome their nostalgia, that they're ready to move on. And I think that's been the conflict all along. That is two characters, but one in particular, Maeve in particular, who are obsessed with the past and can't get over it. And we talked, I think even before the cameras came on, about Maeve and Maeve's job, and she's in frozen vegetables. And I think part of the reason she's elected to keep that job is because it keeps her in town. It keeps her close to the Dutch house. It's an excuse. And she, like those vegetables, is frozen in time. And I think the conflict is when does she become unthawed? And Danny is an observer to that. He actually has a healthier psychology toward both their mother and their stepmother, I think. I think he's right. That question he poses, she could have practiced her altruism, the mother that is, in Brooklyn. Why did she go to India?
Yeah.
And she doesn't stay in India for very long.
That's right. She goes to San Francisco.
Exactly.
I love an interesting idea, Mark, that you bring up. I hadn't sort of thought in that way, but that, you know, I mean, obviously we're not rewriting poor Ann Patchett's book, you know, but there's an interesting thing, because when you said that, what I thought of was, which I neglected to say before, is that one of my hesitations or difficulties with the ending, as it is, had to do with the fact that it seems to shut down all of the mysteries that the novel raises, you know? And there's something lovely about that, having ended a little bit sooner, before the house is restored, before, you know, all of these kinds of things happen, that preserve these mysteries, you know? Like, you know, I didn't I didn't necessarily need to know why Elna left. I was happy with the sort of gestures that point toward it. And I was happy with the house as this sort of object that was a symbol for many, many things, but it was sort of left up in the air so it could continue to be this generator of mystery. And at the end, as it stands, it all sort of comes back down to earth and it closes off some of those mysteries. Whereas perhaps this idea, this notion of having ended earlier, those mysteries might have been preserved and continue to sort of generate, you know?
But go ahead, Maureen.
I'm going to defend my feeling that it's a brilliant ending, because for me, that ending doesn't close off much of anything. I mean, there's that beautiful moment where Danny thinks Maeve, who's died, is back again. And, you know, he sees her in the shadows. And then it turns out that it's his own daughter, Maeve. And so you're close, but you still can't grasp what you want. And it's just that moment. And we still have all of these conflicting stories. I mean, I'll never quite understand why Elna, the mother, went to India or anywhere. You know, it's all in, I mean, a lot of it is interpretation and people's half memories. So, you know, I reread the novel in preparation for this discussion. I was surprised at how rich it was and how still I was asking those kinds of questions. Why? So I don't know. I love novels that I don't feel it does close the door, and I love novels that don't close the door.
I want to go back to the Nutcracker for a moment, because Elizabeth in Frederick, Maryland says, please explain the significance of the Nutcracker stage set to the novel. As I read the description of the ballet's backdrop, floor-to-ceiling windows, and its resemblance to the Dutch house, it seemed like the author was making reference to some larger, never-ending struggle to grow and come to terms with memories. I thought that was very interesting. Any thoughts, Mark?
Well, for one thing, Danny mentions that, yes, this does remind him of the Dutch house, but then again, any sort of glimpse of a wealthier, grander kind of setting also reminds him of the Dutch house. Mm-hmm. And I've seen the Nutcracker a few times, and it's mostly what Clara dreams, I think. Again, I'm coming back to Maeve and what she sort of dreams or imagines or creates in her mind about what the Dutch house was, what it could have been had things worked out the way they should have been in a fairy tale, in a Nutcracker-like fairy tale. Of course, there's also some real intrusions in the Nutcracker. There's some scary scenes, which for the children and you know, especially Danny, who was younger, must have of course been valid. But I guess it's just that notion of fantasy and how ultimately the Dutch house was a fantasy and the mother was a fantasy. And to get back to your question briefly about the mother, I do think she has a mental illness. I don't know how it might be diagnosed, but it's kind of an addiction to altruism, or a painful kind of altruism. It seems she wants to live and help those who truly suffer and therefore suffer herself. So she seems ultimately incapable of living the life she started with her husband and children.
We have another question. Danny asks Maeve, do you think it's possible to ever see the past as it really was? And do you think that this is the theme of the book? Can we ever truly see the past in reality? Or do we create our own memories?
That's the $95 million question. I think the novel just keeps spinning like tumbleweed. You know, we have resting places where we think we see the past clearly, and then it gets more complicated again and again and again.
Yeah. And Ayana, of course, Danny goes all through medical school at the urging of his sister, but another listener says, did he do that just to spend Andrea's mother money, or did he do it because his sister pushed him to do it? He didn't really want to be a doctor.
I thought I actually found that storyline to be kind of hilarious, because I think I'm pretty sure he didn't want to be a doctor. I'm pretty sure he did it out of love for his sister.
Yeah.
And Maeve was the one who was like, we are gonna spend the most expensive educational path you can take is to become a doctor. So that's what you're gonna do, because we're gonna get something over on this woman who has stolen everything from us, you know? So I think it seemed to me that he was very much doing that because of his love and his esteem for his sister, you know?
But didn't he disappoint Celeste, his wife, by turning away from medicine completely? I mean, she married the man she thought was going to be a doctor, and he threw it out the window.
There's an interesting thing happening, I think, in the novel about legacy, because in a certain way, Danny sort of becomes a less gullible and slightly more communicative version of Cyril, his father, right? Like you know what I mean? Like he's certainly capable of communicating a lot more than Cyril was, who was like almost humorously sort of monosyllabic, you know what I mean, about in his responses to things. And so Danny certainly is kind of more evolved in his ability to communicate and things like that. But he does essentially sort of step into his father's shoes. And it seems there's a kind of, I guess, going back almost to the sort of fairy tale aspects. You know, in fairy tale, fate has such a strong role, right? So it's almost like he goes to medical school, he does all of this stuff, yet and still, no matter what, his fate is to become this real estate person like his father. Like his father. And he sort of, so he seems to, despite anything else, despite disappointing Celeste, despite making Maeve unhappy, who is sort of the person that he most wants to please in the world, he kind of can't help himself. You know, he starts seeing these buildings and he is just drawn towards a kind of acquisition in the way that his father was.
I think the novel, you know, as you're talking, Ayana, I think the novel also raises interesting questions about work and the kind of work we think is worth doing and the kind of work we think is less worth doing. And I think it also invites us to kind of interrogate, speaking personally, our own snobbery about what jobs are better than other jobs. I mean, I grew up in a blue collar neighborhood and household. When Maeve says she's happy working at the frozen food place and being the accountant there, you know, I had to catch myself because I was thinking, oh, that's not good enough for Maeve. Well, why not? It's an honorable job. It's a good job with benefits. You know, why am I being so snobby about that? Why is Danny keep urging her to be more? And again, with Danny, well, if he wants to work in real estate rather than a doctor, it's kind of a waste of that medical education.
For sure.
But he never wanted it in the first place.
What about the idea that Maeve and her brother have this intensely close relationship that really doesn't allow Celeste to be there on the same level with her husband as Danny is with Maeve? How did you feel about that, Mark?
Did think it was interesting that we never really got a sense that Danny was passionate about Celeste. that there was a coolness with the way he described her. We could see them connecting even physically, but there wasn't anything in his voice that suggested this was the relationship of his life. And Maeve, yes, she absolutely filled that role for him. Just as Mr. Otterson, her boss, there may have been a relationship there, but it's up to us to kind of read between the lines. She
That's
doesn't come.
what I wanted to ask about. What did you read between the lines between Maeve and Mr. Otterson?
I think there was times where they unfroze each other. Let's put it that way.
Ayana, what did you see in their relationship?
It took me a while, but after a while I did, particularly toward the end, you know, when Maeve had her heart attack, and then certainly when Maeve passes away, the kind of just outsized, incredibly genuine, just grief that Mr. Otterson shows and feels indicated that there was something more than a kind of boss-employee relationship going on there. And it's interesting too how, I guess because Danny is the narrator here, how obscured Maeve is in certain ways. Like I was like, does she have friends? Does she ever have a boyfriend? Does she go to parties? You know, like I had a lot of questions about her. And one of those questions I think was about that Mr. Otterson relationship, which I think then the novel kind of gestures toward an answer, or at least some way to help us think about it. You know, and it was interesting because it made me feel so much better for Maeve, because in a certain sense, Danny kind of had all of these like surrogate mothers. Do you know what I mean? Like he had Jocelyn, he had Sandy, he had Fluffy, who hits him in the head with a spoon, but nonetheless, you know, and certainly he had Maeve, you know, and I think he had Celeste in a sense, who kind of wanted to have that role, but he wouldn't allow himself to be taken care of by her. But that in contrast with Maeve, who, and there's even a line early on in the novel about how when the father is still in the picture, when Danny says, well, you know, Maeve was sort of expected to help me with my homework and do these kind of mother-like things, but no one did that for Maeve. Mm-hmm. And so that was, and that kind of went on throughout the novel. Like she was so sort of unmothered and uncared for in a certain sense. So I was sort of which would also explain why she has such mother want and is so, I can't even think of the proper word when her mother returns, when Elena comes back into the picture. But back to Mr. Otterson, in certain ways, it sort of made me feel better. I was like, well, at least there was some sort of aspect of her life that felt, that was personally fulfilling, other than the relationship with taking care of her brother and such.
And here's a question from one of our listeners saying the novel shows familial love and caring by people who aren't the obvious sources. The mothers and fathers are all very flawed, whereas others, Jocelyn, Sandy, Maeve, Fluffy, are the ones who nurture. Is this saying that traditional families are not, are not the ideal, and rightfully so?
Well, it takes a village, and I think this illustrates that. I don't know that this is necessarily a comment on traditional marriage or the nuclear family, but we certainly do see the value of accepting love, receiving love, caring for others outside of that nuclear structure.
You know, I heard Ann Patchett say once, and maybe she'll talk about this when she speaks with you, Diane, but that all of her novels are about groups of people sort of being thrown together, and you don't expect that it's going to work, but it works. And they're outside of that traditional nuclear family configuration. And once again, I feel like we've got it here. By the way a lot of these people reconnect with each other speaks to Ayana's point about fate. I mean, the way people run into each other in New York, you know, Fluffy sees Elna, and then
Right.
Elna happens to be in the emergency room when Danny is working. I mean, it's really kind of remarkable. I mean, it happens, but perhaps a little bit more in this novel than it does in life.
Our viewers have so many good questions. Here's another one. What about the link between Maeve's illness and the disappearance of her mother, and then her final heart attack when her mother goes back to the Dutch house? She leaves Maeve, and Maeve dies of a heart attack 2 weeks later. What do you make of that?
I think she died of a broken heart in a sense. I think she had this wonderful reunion with her mother, but then she was, in a sense, betrayed. So it's a physical representation of the internal, the emotional journey she's been on all along, that her illness does manifest itself often as in concert with her psychological state.
Wow. So are you suggesting that, I mean, obviously we can't rewrite Anne's novel, but are you suggesting that Maeve would have remained alive longer if her mother had not gone to the Dutch house to take care of Andrea?
I think that's a possibility.
What do you think, Maureen?
I mean, I have to mull that one over. I hadn't laid all of that on Elna's shoulders. I kind of thought, well, Elna's still in the picture, and we've already known that Maeve has a weak heart. And it was, I love what Maeve says when Danny challenges her about, why are you so forgiving of our mother? Why are you taking her back? And Maeve says, well, I've realized that, time is finite, and I can either spend the rest of this time being angry at our mother, or I can embrace her again. And I guess I feel like she died fulfilled. She got her mother back, even if her mother wasn't actually living in her house with her.
The book jumps around in time a lot. Did you find that a useful part of the novel, or did you find that confusing?
I thought, as a person who's written a novel that does weird things with time, I actually, I really enjoyed the way that she sort of manages time in this novel. I mean, essentially, we're moving we're sort of moving, we're on a forward trajectory in what we might be able to call the current action of the novel. But I think that those backward leaps, which are long and substantive and quite juicy, for lack of a better word, I think that those are wonderfully managed. And they're also wonderfully managed by using this device of the two of them sitting in the car. They're sitting in the car, parked outside of the sort of this place and this object that is so loaded and so full of memory. And there they remember. And so I thought that it was really nicely done.
I am bothered by the fact that Danny repeated his father's mistake. That is, buying this house with 4 flights of stairs that Celeste, with children, when they came, was going to have to go up and down. Was Danny sort of lacking in self-understanding, self-reflection, not even seeing that connection between what he had done to his wife and what his father had done to his mother?
I think there's a degree of that, absolutely. I was also curious about the agency of the women in these situations too. So Elna, when that happened, it was sometime in the deeper past. But why didn't Celeste come out earlier and say, "Hey, buddy, this isn't what I want.
Yeah.
Let's rethink this"?
So you're saying she could have done something about it.
I was curious why she didn't step forward and say something. I know she's been kind of accommodating to him all along, but it clearly bothered her. So I did wonder why she didn't allude to it anyway.
Was she too accommodating to him because she adored him from the first time she saw him?
I think that was part of it. She had a real understanding of his needs, even eventually she ultimately, when they were dating, stayed with him 2 nights as opposed to the 3 that she would have preferred. She had a very subtle understanding of his needs. But she could ultimately she divorced him, which was interesting. That just was dropped into the novel, kind of almost as an aside. It might have been a bigger deal in a different kind of novel, but she eventually stepped forward and said enough was enough. And Danny's explanation was that Maeve was now off the scene, and so Celeste could see him quite clearly without blaming the sister, because she wasn't around to blame anymore.
That was a shocker that they divorced after having those children and really adoring those children, and yet she left him.
But not an unfamiliar story. I mean, it's sort of the stereotypical pattern of the kids go to college and the parents divorce, if that's going to happen. I remember that Danny said one of the things he liked about Celeste was that she left him alone. You know, other girlfriends who he had kind of wanted more attention or wanted to talk, and she was happy to lose herself in her big fat Victorian novel and leave him his alone time, which again, the energy is with Maeve. It's almost, I kept thinking of Salinger's Franny and Zoe, the brother-sister pair, and it's so intense. And right, you want them to be together because they get each other in a way that no one else in the novel does.
Why do you think Maeve refused to come to New York, Ayana?
I'm really, I'm not sure. I mean, I think certainly there was, I think she was feeling this sort of, the absence of her mother with caretaking for Danny in a certain way. It was like she couldn't have her mother back. So there's this sort of gaping something, and it seemed to me that in a certain way she was filling that by taking care of Danny, and that to go to New York and be inside of Danny's family life, however it was, I mean, we don't know a lot about what the dynamics were on the day-to-day there, but it seemed to me that there was something there that was really, that she feared might be very painful for her, or that she feared a certain kind of displacement or something like that. But it did seem to me that she felt not something so simple as jealousy. I think that whatever wound that was creating in her was deeper than a kind of superficial envy. But there was something about perhaps watching him being lost to her, though he never was, inside of a family life, that she really just didn't want to see, it seemed to me, to some extent.
And then the Nutcracker, and watching his daughter on stage, and then headed for the party to celebrate his daughter. And what happens? Instead, he has to take Maeve to the hospital. Celeste, do you think she understood that?
I think there'd be a great knockoff novel to be written called Celeste's Story. Because we don't really hear her story.
We don't.
We're not encouraged to even particularly want to hear her story. Like this conversation has made me more curious about her, but the novel keeps pushing me away from her. And I'm kind of curious now to get a sense of what her take Danny and Maeve would have been, and just her take on this whole novel that we've been reading and talking about.
Mark?
Yeah, I think both women seem to feel territorial, literally. That is, they wanted to keep in their own particular camps. But I do think, and Celeste did come around to being more generous toward Maeve when Maeve was ill during that scene after the Nutcracker. So she did rise to the occasion, where Andrea, for example, probably would have not have risen to the occasion and been a good sport and helpful in that. But it seemed like maybe the Danny Maeve relationship was just too intricate, too complex for Celeste to really dive into. And I don't think Maeve for her part, wanted to see her brother in a happy household. I think she wanted her brother for herself, in a sense, to have that image of her brother as always her younger brother who needed her mothering and didn't have this other kind of life apart from her.
Are you saying that Maeve was ultimately the selfish person in this novel?
I don't know. I think she had bouts of selfishness, perhaps, but self-preserving selfishness, maybe. She didn't want to be hurt. I think Ayana mentioned that. I think actually one could make a case that the two mothers here, the older mothers, Elna and Andrea, are the most selfish characters in the book, and they are the true antagonists, not the protagonists, but the antagonists.
And finally, is Andrea in her wickedness truly believable?
Yes. Yes.
I would have liked to see more of her, more of that wickedness play out in scene, and also some of the attraction that Cyril, the father, felt for her, but it's believable.
Yeah, I had the same sense. It felt believable. I also wanted to see it play out a little bit more with Norma and Bright, like when they were little. And when Danny was still in the house, before Cyril passes away and Andrea throws them out, I kind of wanted to see a little bit. We see her being sort of superficially perfect with her daughters. Oh, girls, but I kind of wanted to see a little bit more, like, sort of what the wicked stepmother is like with the daughters. Mm-hmm. And I also, the other thing that came to mind was that the sort of part of Andrea's wickedness is this kind of obsession with things, which seems to be a major theme in the novel, right? Like Cyril's obsessed with the Dutch house, so he's got to get it. He's also obsessed with these properties. And then Danny becomes obsessed with properties and things. So it's kind of, there's an interesting thing. And Andrea is sort of a kind of culmination of an obsession with stuff. And is sort of the most wicked manifestation of that, which I did find kind of interesting thematically.
Well, I have to ask Ann Patchett to write a few more novels about these characters. I want to thank you all so much for being here for this really fascinating discussion. You're just wonderful guests, and you've been so forthcoming. Maureen Corrigan, Ayana Mathis, and Mark Brazaitis, thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And to our viewers, please, before you go, take a minute to fill out the short survey about this event that pops up on your screen. And if you would, consider making a donation to WAMU. Your financial support is what makes it possible for us to continue to bring you events like this. Go to dianerehm.org/give. And the next meeting of my book club will be on Wednesday, February 24th, we'll be discussing The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. Stay tuned to your email for more details. Thanks again so much for joining us, and we'll hope to see you again next month. Goodbye, all.